There is a persistent myth that marketing theory is an ivory tower luxury, an abstract exercise divorced from the hard realities of corporate survival. To dismantle this, we have to distinguish between two different activities. First, there is market research. This is the applied, localized work a company does to solve an immediate problem, like pricing a specific software subscription for the current quarter. Then there is marketing research, the scholarly pursuit. This side of the discipline seeks to expand the foundational knowledge of how exchange and value work across the entire economy, regardless of the individual firm. The tension arises when practitioners evaluate scholarly research using the metrics of applied problem solving. If a paper doesn't offer an immediate financial return, it often faces dismissal as useless theory. We can separate these domains with one question: what do we know about marketing in general now that we didn't know before? Confusing these two distinct objectives creates a false dichotomy between theory and practice. It obscures the fact that effective strategy relies on the bedrock of academic rigor. It's easy to assume that in a market moving at the speed of algorithms, abstract models are too slow to be useful. But the function of any scientific theory is highly practical. Its purpose is to increase our understanding by systematically explaining why things happen and predicting what will happen next. A manager cannot prescribe what a company should do without first being able to explain the current market and predict the outcome of their actions. Theory provides the mechanics for those predictions. To function, a valid theory requires specific structural components. It must contain systematically related statements, law-like generalizations, and it must be empirically testable. This chart shows the life cycle of theoretical application. We start with the perception of a raw marketing situation, move into mathematical abstraction to quantify relationships, and then use a feedback loop to apply that model back to the problem. If a framework lacks predictive power and empirical testability, it fails the definition of a theory. It is merely armchair philosophy. Because theory is the only reliable engine we have for predicting human behavior and market dynamics, generating it is one of the most practical intellectual pursuits in the discipline. If we want to determine whether marketing is a science, we first have to map its boundaries, and those boundaries are notoriously vast. To solve this, Shelby D. Hunt developed the Three Dichotomies Model, a taxonomical framework that categorizes the entire discipline. The first axis divides the discipline by organizational objective, profit versus nonprofit. The second separates the aggregation level, micro for individual firms, macro for societal systems. The third splits positive, what actually exists, and normative, what organizations ought to do. This creates 8 distinct cells, proving that marketing mechanics extend far beyond corporate boardrooms and quarterly earnings. For example, evaluating whether a nationwide charitable campaign effectively combats disease falls into the macro, nonprofit, and normative cell. It applies marketing systems to a public health scale. Meanwhile, campaigns aimed at individual behavioral change, like preventing forest fires, occupy the micro, nonprofit, and normative space, known as social marketing. This model prevents premature closure of the discipline. It stops us from artificially restricting what counts as marketing and welcomes diverse research perspectives. It shows that corporate managers, macro system analysts, and social marketers are all executing different functions within the exact same underlying matrix. This taxonomy allows us to settle a historical debate. Can a field focused on strategy actually be classified as a science? If marketing were restricted exclusively to prescribing how managers should maximize profits, the answer would be no. That restricted view isolates us inside this single cell, micro, normative, and profit-driven. Purely normative disciplines focus on subjective oughts. Because they prioritize evaluation over the explanation of objective phenomena, they fail the basic criteria of scientific inquiry. However, when the discipline analyzes what actually exists, how consumers behave or how distribution networks form, it enters a different domain. These are the positive dimensions of the taxonomy. Here, the focus shifts to objective research. In these cells, researchers identify a distinct subject matter, the exchange relationship, and test hypotheses to uncover underlying causal structures. Marketing qualifies as a science because it maps, analyzes, and predicts these real-world positive phenomena, rather than solely dispensing advice to managers. Critics often argue that marketing relies on soft methods like behavioral observations, lacking the hard logic of physics. But this entirely misses the single scientific method thesis. Regardless of the specific tools used, all true sciences share a unified logic for validating knowledge. To understand this, we must draw a strict boundary. The context of discovery is characterized by creativity, intuition, and non-logical jumps. A hypothesis here can originate from anywhere: an accident, a dream, or a wild metaphor like comparing a market to a battlefield. But the context of justification is the rigid, objective procedure used to test and accept or reject those creative claims against empirical data. Evaluating a theory based on its messy origins, rather than its empirical testing, is known as the genetic fallacy. An idea born from an unscientific hunch can still become a rigorous scientific law, provided it survives the gauntlet of justification. Marketing's scientific legitimacy doesn't depend on how elegantly it generates ideas. It depends entirely on how ruthlessly it justifies them. Sustaining this level of rigor requires an underlying philosophical architecture to support objective justification. The first pillar of this architecture is critical pluralism. Critical pluralism demands an open posture toward new theories and methodologies, but it is strictly anti-relativistic. It does not claim that all ideas are equally valid. Instead, it requires all theories to submit to uncompromising critical scrutiny. Nothing is immune from being tested and potentially falsified. This leads directly to the second pillar, scientific realism. Scientific realism maintains that the world exists independently of our perception. The job of science is to develop knowledge that truly maps onto that reality. Within this framework, concepts like brand equity or market segments are more than organizational shorthand. They represent actual entities that the theory aims to describe with precision. A theory that accurately maps to the world provides a lever for specific results. We see the impact in the eradication of smallpox, a success built on the predictive power of a validated model. This brings us back to the perceived divide between the researcher and the practitioner. Rather than just being an abstract distraction, marketing theory serves as the foundational scientific architecture for mastering the real world.